And so the work you're doing is advising on policy. And in doing so, you're obviously supporting the government, supporting the state, supporting politicians, helping people to create policy whereby the money they collect either from tax, which it seems to be less and less these days, or from deficit spending, goes towards creating opportunities for others. So in the world of Bitcoin, some people are very anti-government, anti-tax, anti-redistribution of money. What arguments would you give to, what empirical evidence do you have that doing this kind of work is good for everyone, it benefits everyone?
Well, if we look throughout human history, we have lots of unequal societies. In fact, almost every society is unequal. It's just a matter of degree, right? And I would argue, I think all the evidence suggests that the least unequal societies are those where the economy is dynamic, where people can start from very little and grow into something more, whether it's through working hard in school and getting a good education and getting a good job, or whether it's starting a business that ends up growing into something else, or whether it's you got into Bitcoin in 2011 on your laptop and you were mining it and that was your route to success. There are lots of different ways to be successful, but societies that are more innovative, they're more dynamic, that have fewer restrictions to competing with the status quo, with the establishment, those are the societies that tend to be the most equal. To give an example from history, when the bubonic plague blew out Europe and 50% of the population got decimated by the plague, that was one of the great democratizing episodes in history, because all of a sudden labor was really scarce. And so this old feudal system had to make way to a more modern system in which you actually had to say, you know what, if you want to work for me, I got to pay you more. And that then led to the prosperity of a lot of people who then had more political power as a result. So if you want a more politically equal society, if you want a more economically equal society, then you have to have a society where more people can work and grow their own earnings. And the way you do that is by having a vibrant economy where people, various businesses and various employers are competing for your labor, for your services.
I agree with you. And ethically, I agree with you, and morally, I agree with you. I think it is good to have a more equal society, especially in a society where some people were just born into a luckier house or a luckier situation. And I was afforded great parents who gave me great education, gave me an opportunity. I know other people aren't. Other people out there, though, Avik, will be like, well, I don't care. So are there actual other benefits where it benefits that person? Does it lead to lower crime? Should it ultimately lead to lower taxation because there's less of a demand on the welfare state?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to say about that. I would start with, let's just bring it back to Bitcoin for a second. So you're absolutely right that a lot of the culture of Bitcoin is this very much this kind of leave me alone libertarianism, which says, hey, I've made it and I'm really proud of the fact that I got in early enough and I'm doing well with it, and just I don't want anyone to mess with that. And I get that as a human instinct, but if that's your point of view, then you should be especially concerned that if you're right about Bitcoin, that if Bitcoin is what we all think it is, that it's going to grow over time relative to the US dollar and to other fiat currencies, that those who got in earlier, who've been stacking sats, are going to do better than those who have not, then there's going to be a lot of inequality generated by that. And the people who did not get in early, or who have not gotten in even now, the no-coiners, so to speak, they're going to be even more resentful. We see that actually. One of the things that's interesting politically, if you think about it here and also in the U.S. and also around the country, around the world, Bitcoin is out of the headlines because its price action has not been as interesting, and as a result, it's not politically in the headlines either. Right? There isn't as much work going on to whack down the Bitcoin community because Bitcoin has price has not been as newsworthy as it's been in the past, right? So, if Bitcoin goes to 400,000 or 1 million or what have you, I think it's Balaji Srinivasan who calculated that at that point, I can't remember the exact price point. I think it's 200,000 or 400,000, where there will be more Bitcoin billionaires in the world than fiat billionaires. Like, that's a pretty big tipping point, right? If that actually does happen, you better believe the knives are going to be out for those Bitcoin billionaires. And so if we don't have a public spiritedness about the way we build this ecosystem, then there can be a lot of effort by governments, by people to blow up the thing that all of us have worked so hard to build.
the kind of ideas that you were talking about there, the public spiritedness, it's very European. I think is a little bit more European in the way of thinking, and I can't help but keep coming back to this, thinking about this. Like when I made the film, the thing that really stood out to me, and I wanted to come back to you and ask you about, is that you can do all this great work, Avik, and you can make all this opportunity. But if we have poor monetary and fiscal policy coming from the government and all these other geopolitical issues, is that actually destroying some of the work that you've been working on? I'll give you an example. With the massive increase in energy prices in the UK, there were people getting energy bills, like could be a cafe or whatever business. I was listening to one interview on the radio as a company that it was a cake business. They made pastries. They had to close down their 3 or 4 cafes. They had to close those down, and they only now make at a central bakery, and they sell them on wholesale. But they had to close down all 3 businesses. So how do you approach this now, knowing that everything else has happened that's essentially destroying the opportunity for small businesses?
Yeah, that's a great way to ask the question. And the way I would put it is, it's really important to distinguish between the status quo policy environment, which some people call the market, and what an actual free market looks like. What we've seen, particularly in economies that are stagnant or in recession or declining, is that people will blame the market for that result and not understand how much government has rigged the system to create that result. To give an example, the financial bailouts in 2008, right? That inspired in many ways the Bitcoin white paper. That was an example of, in many ways, socializing the downside for the banks, but letting them protect their own upside, right? And the Federal Reserve is doing the same thing. It used to be called the Greenspan put or the Bernanke put. And for those who don't follow options trading terminology, what that means is basically your downside was always protected, because if the financial system was starting to suffer, or the stock market was starting to go down, Bernanke or Greenspan would come in and flood the market with money to prop up the markets for you, the financial community. And that's not a free market system. That's the government stepping in and saying, we're going to make your dollars less valuable so that financial institutions can thrive and do better. That's not a fair system. It's
not a fair system. Is it a system where they are trying to protect the rich, or is it a system where they're trying to protect the economy and by virtue of that, the rich benefit?
Well, that's exactly the theory. There was this old saying in the mid 20th century: "What's good for General Motors is good for America." And the idea was, because General Motors was this titan of American industry, that what the CEOs and the executives of General Motors wanted the government to do, the government should do, because General Motors makes cars, General Motors employs tens of thousands of people, and the economy of the U.S. will benefit from all the things that General Motors does to be the engine of the economy, literally and figuratively. So, but that theory, I think, turns out to be very flawed. In that when you focus on what's in the interests of an individual business, I think 70, 80 years ago, it may have been a little different in that I think there was still that sense of, from corporate America, well, we really have to think about the national interest. We can't just think about our own narrow self-interest. That happened too. But I think there was very much a culture in the U.S. of, hey, because it was just after World War II, there was very much this sense of solidarity. There was this sense of, hey, we've got to do what's in the American interest, not just in our own interest. The corporate world today is much more out for itself. Each company is out for itself in a way that I think was less true 70 years ago, 75 years ago. And as a result, there is not this idea that what's good for a particular business or a particular industry being good for the rest of society isn't necessarily true. It might be that, or you have to make a distinction, right? The distinction is this incumbent player, the big oil companies, say, or the big bank, may have a certain interest, and that interest may be different from what the disruptive innovator in that sector wants, right? But the entrepreneurs, the disruptors, don't have lobbyists. They don't have time. When you're building a new business, you're just busy trying to keep the lights on. You don't have time to hire lobbyists to tell senators what to do. You're just hoping that you can make payroll the next month, right? Whereas if you're a BP or you're Deutsche Bank or JP Morgan, You've got armies of these lobbyists who have built decades of relationships with legislators, and they're saying, "Oh yeah, you should do this, you should do that." So there's a competitive advantage to being an established incumbent that often ends up steering people in the wrong direction. I'll give you some examples. So several years ago, we had a situation where the big banks basically, because everyone knew they'd get bailed out if they failed, could borrow money at lower rates than smaller banks. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that means smaller banks basically can't offer competitive mortgages or competitive car loans because JP Morgan, say, or Bank of America can offer at lower interest rates because they're bigger, because everyone knows they'll get bailed out by the government. Now, if you try to reform that system, those lobbyists from JP Morgan and Bank of America will say, gosh, you can't regulate us in that way. If we have to charge higher interests for home loans and car loans, then we won't be able to offer mortgages to people. People won't buy cars, and that'll crash the economy. You can't do that, right? And it's this very similar thing. What's good for Bank of America is good for America. That's the argument. And you have to be pretty sophisticated as a senator to know that that is a self-interested and flawed argument. And that's where guys like me come in, or our organization comes in, where we try to brief these senators, we try to brief members of Congress or regulators or people in the White House and say, hey, here are some of the things that Bank of America is not explaining when they say what they're saying.